I'm Alberto Veiga from Barozzi Veiga. First, I wanted to thank you for inviting me to talk about this project. I mean, the Oolite Arts Miami, which is a project around the idea of how to build artist studios. And by the moment, it's just a project, it's not built yet. But my aim today is to just explain you the ideas that we have and that we had basically in the background of our practice when doing this project. Oolite Arts is a non-profit foundation, which basically they use a kind of statement or a kind of motto, which is like they try to help artists to help themselves. They basically help artists in order to become professionals. So they run a program, yearly and bi-yearly program, where they basically offer all the needs that an artist may have in order to become a professional. So the program of the building was quite, very interesting for us, because basically it was about 21 studios for artists, every kind of artist. I mean, painters, sculptors, artists working with video, images. I mean, so quite eclectic collection of studios. And then a program based basically in how to foster the public and the private. I mean, because they wanted to have a small theater, a library, 2 classrooms, then in a smaller space for the people who works for the Oolite Arts. And basically, they were aiming us to find a project where we could somehow engage artists and the communities surrounding the artists, I mean, the citizens, the neighborhood. And so the brief was really interesting as architects, because I mean, this idea of how to propose something where we could somehow investigate about not just the idea of the studio and the privacy that the studio needs, but the idea of how to open the studio to the community, to the citizens, how to find a place where artists could exchange experiences, but at the same time they could exchange their experiences with the citizens, with the Miamians, was very interesting, because one of the goals for the artist is not just to produce arts, but to show it to the citizens, and if possible to sell it to, because they need to get it to, or they are trying to, as I said, to become professionals. So from an architectural point of view, the program description was really interesting. The site is not perhaps what everybody or all of us can have about Miami. We're not talking about Miami Beach. We are talking about a neighborhood, Little Haiti, in the interior of the Miami coast, which had industrial past. Basically, I mean, this black hatch you can see here it's the plot that they bought in order to relocate their institution. So basically, I mean, within this, I mean, let's say fabric within this neighborhood, which was characterized basically by not just by the train tracks that crosses, I mean, the train tracks that are crossing the neighborhood, but basically characterized by a collection of warehouses, industrial buildings. So in a landscape that I could define like a hard landscape, I mean, quite dry, quite just the opposite of what perhaps we have in mind when talking about Miami. The plot was suggesting basically try to get profit of, well, the plot, we were trying to understand the site in order to get profit of it, in order to do not produce a generic piece of architecture, a generic approach that could just forget about the site just because of the fact that it was an industrial site. So we wanted to really to understand the site in order to recover somehow the essence of this place, trying to be as specific as possible, because our practice believes that the reason for each architecture is try to be as specific as possible. Whatever we work, I mean, it's a kind of goal that we always have when working in different places. And so in this in particular site, I mean, the idea was trying to work with this idea of the industrial place close to the train tracks, how to compose something that could be related with that, but at the same time try to recover somehow some of the nature of the site before somehow the change that this site had when became an industrial site. So as you can see here, I mean, the proportions of the site are quite particular. I mean, this is like a plot of 150 meters by 25 meters. So this linearity somehow was quite interesting for us since the very beginning, along the train tracks, as I said. This somehow shaped the approach we had towards the building. When you start working and you start designing somehow, I mean, well, we all have a backpack, and somehow we all try to reflect all our obsessions and all our desires into what we are designing. And basically, well, we were trying to investigate some of the themes that we had in mind since in our office as a practice. But thinking about the program and thinking about this aim of trying to find a place where artists and citizens could exchange experiences somehow, we became into the idea of basically I would say, to re-tropicalize the site, try to compose a kind of oasis where people could find just a place to exchange somehow, public space. Oolite is not a public foundation, but it's a private organization. But basically, they have the aim to become a building, to become a space that can be open to the public. So this idea of reintroduce nature into this hard landscape, this idea of composing a space of exchange, and a space where artists and citizens could somehow learn from each other. And the program itself, this collection of different uses and this collection of studios took us to the idea of understand the project as a kind of a collection of rooms around the idea of a garden that basically symbolizes this moment of exchange for us, an element that help us to compose and help us to understand the building as a landscape, a kind of microcosm, a collection of unique spaces, or at least this is the aim of the project, to create a collection of unique spaces around this common space, which is the garden. And so, working with these ideas in mind, we got to this proposal. I mean, a proposal that somehow combines what we thought were the essentials of the site. On one hand, the industrial past, how to compose something using an argument and the narratives that we can find in the industrial places, the repetition of an element, try to provoke or try to compose something in a very simple way, complex, but at the same time easy to compose in order to become expressive. That's something that we linked with the idea of the warehouses and with the idea of the industrial buildings that were surrounding us. How to provoke or how to compose a building which could become a landscape in this site. The building is quite, well, it's not a huge building, it's 3,000 square meters, just in one level, but we had the need of being very expressive with the building that we were proposing. I mean, this idea of highlighting a civic figure into the neighborhood was very important for us, and try to declare that the building is an important building within the neighborhood and within Miami and within the cultural life of Miami was very important. So that's why we wanted to achieve a kind of a strong building that could express somehow its importance. And on the other hand, to compose something that could somehow go deeper into this idea of how to generate private spaces, intimate spaces where artists could focus about the artistic experience and how to create art. So that's why we started to compose a building based in these vertical elements that you are looking at here. These elements that mainly are skylights facing the north and looking for northern light. The building reflects about the idea of how to introduce light into the studios, how to play with the fundamentals of the artistic experience. Basically, in the studio for us was ease and space, where the proportions, where the natural light, and where the material that you use compose basically the best background that we can propose to the artists in order to reflect about their artistic approach somehow. So this idea of these vertical elements, how to compose a landscape composed by singular pieces that could somehow generate, as I said, a landscape of a microcosm, was basically the tool that we were using in order to generate our architecture. Every single element on top of this plinth, this horizontal element, it's not then became more than skylights, but it's an element that it's related with a singular space below them. It's an element that helps us to introduce natural light, but on the other hand, it's an element that helps us to define the public figure that we were looking for since the very beginning. It's an element that helps us to mix this idea of the intimate and the private with the idea of the public space and the common spaces that the building composes in the interior of the garden. And at the same time, reflects about the industrial past of the site. Somehow, it's a very basic approach towards, in terms of architecture, towards to what's in the studio and what's for example, the small gallery that we have into the building. But it was intentional. This approach. I mean, we wanted to play, as I said, with the fundamentals. We wanted to achieve interior and exterior spaces where the play with the lights, the idea of how to play with proportions, how to somehow compose something complex through very easy movements could be at the base of the thoughts somehow that were guiding this project. So that's why, as you can see in these study models, I mean, basically had to understand this interior landscape through just the basics. I mean, one single material, the light, and the proportions of the elements were for us the tools that had to drive the entire design. So basically, the sketch just reflects about that. Simple gestures that could compose this public space, this garden in between them. And that's the way the building appears somehow, as this collection of buildings, small buildings, 7 buildings, each building organized in different uses, each building somehow playing with the same tools and playing with the same guidelines than the other 6, but at the same time composing something then becomes expressive and becomes, from our point of view, strong, because the building needed to express, as I said, the importance of the civic figure that we were looking for somehow. So from outside, the building appears almost as a kind of fortress, as I said, characterized by these vertical elements, these towers. The towers, as I said at the beginning, when designing the project, were just skylights, skylights that were introducing natural light, northern lights into the studios, but the skylights were introducing natural light in the other uses. The library, the gallery, the admin building, the classrooms. But at a certain point, we thought that wasn't enough because somehow we wanted to explore better the idea of how to get profit of the existing somehow in this place, and how to be more conscious about nowadays about all what is surrounding from well, I would say sustainable point of view, what it means to build nowadays, and how to get profit of the existing, basically. So it's true that we started to investigate how these elements could somehow be transformed in something different. And helping us to improve the design and helping us to improve, or I would say, to get a better environment. So each tower became, well, some of them remained as skylights, but a lot of them became different uses. We introduced the idea of solar chimneys, wind catchers, water tanks, elements for the mechanicals, because we wanted to find a meaning for each one of them. We wanted to generate something in terms of architecture, as I said, a bit. Somehow we wanted to achieve some complexity, but using just this simplicity or these simple elements. No? And the idea of finding a meaning for each element was related not just with an obsession of how to put as many elements as possible outside. It was related with the fact that to compose a garden, to design a garden in Miami in these days means try to improve a bit the environment, try to, just simple tools, try to speed up the air as much as possible in order to get more comfort, try to use the water tanks to harvesting rainwater and using it into the building, how to use the solar panels on top of the building in a way that would help us to reduce the energy consumption, how to integrate the wind catcher as elements that could somehow, again, enhance the flow of air within the studios and within the public uses. So step by step, these elements became not just a tool for designing the building, but became part of the essence of the building in terms of how the building works and how the building helps somehow the spaces in order to have a better environment, let's say, for the artists. So as you can see here in this plan, as I said, all the uses are spread in just one level. This means that from east to west, we compose all the uses in 7 buildings. The studios are always organized in groups of 5 studios. For example, this building here, this is an ensemble of 5 studios around a common space that provokes the entrance towards the building and provokes somehow a moment of transition before entering the studios, coming from the exterior. And well, the other buildings are just variations in terms of language of the buildings of the studios, just to compose other uses. This is the gallery, for example. Here at the back on the west side, we have the theater. This is the admin building. Here we have the library in this area, or here we have the classrooms. So basically using the same language, but just variating somehow this language, we were trying to get the best proportions and the best dimensions for these different uses, always trying to get a balance between the private spaces and the public spaces, which mainly is the gardening, which appears carved or sculpted in this way inside the building. So there is an intentional contrast between the exterior and interior. There is a need for us, from our point of view, to exaggerate a bit this contrast. I mean, the idea of the unexpected. As soon as you enter the building, you discover the garden, and you discover the garden in a way that you didn't expect when you saw it from outside, when you saw the building from outside. Well, these were just basic schemes just to explain somehow about how, well, just to explain the idea of how these elements, these vertical towers, which are quite high because this, the top level reaches, 9 meters of height. So how these elements helped us to enhance somehow the environment or the atmosphere that we were proposing into the building. Everything is, in terms of materiality, everything is understood just with the idea of using just one single material. In this case, recycled concrete, because we wanted to propose something that could be, well, let's say we were trying to find or to find somehow a sculptural approach to the project in terms of using one single material, that could somehow transform in a more three-dimensional approach to the architecture in this case. That helped us in order to play with these simple forms, shapes somehow, and the use of one single material helped us in order to keep the strength of the volumes, let's say. And this appears not just outside, but inside too. One single material that defines all the interiors, all the exteriors, because the building is just a background. And we didn't want to propose really that could compete against what was happening inside the studios. We didn't want to propose something that could, in terms of material, that could somehow diminishes, the importance of the garden. We wanted really to understand the garden and the building as two elements with the same importance, and two elements where, for example, in this case, we're looking at the building from inside. The architecture could be almost just a kind of frame for the garden, for the idea of the garden. So this is how the building appears inside. Well, this is a view from the interior garden somehow, and how these pure forms of this basic approach towards what's a studio, basically in a space with a good proportion and the best natural light that you can achieve, appears confronted with the idea of the garden. And step by step, we composed all the uses somehow in the same way, always trying to, as I said, to study in the position of all the elements, try to compose this microcosm. We like to describe it as a kind of a microcosm, where the building always tries to relate with the exterior, with the idea of the garden, these oases for artists that we were proposing. So this is a view of one of the entrances of one of the 7 buildings. We call it as kind of enclosed garden. It's in a space of transition, and a space that we use to relate with the wind catchers, just to have a better flow of air under the shadow in this space. It's in a space that appears always framing the exterior garden, and a space that helps somehow to change the mood before entering into the studios. The studios that, as I was describing, are characterized in a very simple way. I mean, one material as a perfect background for the artists. I mean, the studios are going to be characterized by the artists. Every 2 years, the artists are going to change. So somehow we couldn't impose a way of using these studios. I mean, we wanted to achieve, or we wanted to offer them as much freedom as possible. But at the same time, we wanted to characterize it in a very strong way, as I said, with the natural light, the northern light, and with the views toward the garden. The views towards the garden, not just because of the importance of the garden or the importance of in terms of design of the opening towards the interior, because the windows, the openings, I mean, are almost, well, in this case, are acting always as displays. Displays where the artists can show, can exhibit, I mean, what they produce, what they do. Because as I said, one of the goals of the institution of Oolite is to help them to become professionals. So they need to exhibit what they do. A display that can be closed in case they want to have more privacy, but that basically acts as a way of exchanging what happens inside and outside. It's a kind of filter between privacy or intimacy and the publicness that we have outside in the garden. And as I said, I mean, with these simple tools, these simple guidelines, if you want to call it guidelines, we were defining all the spaces. For example, this is a view of the gallery, of the exhibiting gallery, just changing the proportions, trying to keep it as simple as possible. To get simplicity nowadays means to deal with the complexities of building something in a very complex way. Somehow we wanted to transmit this idea of simplicity, just to focus about the importance of what's going inside every building. I mean, in this case, the experience of looking at the artworks, and that's why, technically speaking, the building it's complex too. It's not a simple building. It tries to express simplicity, but it's quite sophisticated in terms of how to deal with all the needs that a contemporary building needs. So this was the gallery. For example, this view of the Makerspace and the print shop. I mean, a use that is open 24 hours, 7 days by week. One of the parts, for example, this is a perfect example of why this program was so interesting. I mean, how to mix the idea of a public building with the idea of private uses and the intimacy that the studio needs. So, and that's why the program of this institution of Oolite is so unique and so interesting for us as architects in terms of how to design a building, because we had the opportunity to investigate different ways of exchanging, I mean, and experiences between users and visitors, or in this case, for example, the theater, in a small theater for 150 people, where they are going to run a public program of lectures and shows, and how the building could get profit of that in terms of design, how the garden could make sense when something is going on into the theater or into the classrooms or into the makerspace, but at the same time, how the studios could compose this private microcosm that I was describing before. And this idea of microcosm on landscape, this idea that depending on who is working inside the studios are going to, well, somehow we wanted to express it from outside. The idea that this landscape, depending of, as I said, who is working inside, is going to change constantly, day by day, night by night. The idea that it's a building that tries to tries to generate, as I said, a public figure, but at the same time changes constantly depending of the users, depending of who is inside, reflecting about the idea that what the most important is what's going on inside the studios. It's expressed outside just through the skylights, just through the openings, just highlighting this strength, the strength of the use that we are containing inside the building.